In 1824, Kentucky, a white planter filed for divorce from his wife on the grounds that she was engaged in a licentious and ongoing affair with a young black male slave named Edmund. He is referenced only as a possession, the object of the wife's obsession. Her husband claimed that she summoned Edmund to her room nightly. Edmund was sold, quietly, swiftly. No investigation, no defense. What we know about Edmund is tragic. In the antebellum South, slavery was more than labor. It was a brutal system of power, control, and dehumanization. While forced relationships between white male masters and black female slaves are widely documented, far less is known about the abuse of black male enslaved persons at the hands of white women. Yet survivors' accounts and historical studies reveal that white women could wield sexual violence, ranging from assault to coerced reproduction, against black men, exploiting their bodies and erasing their autonomy.
Stay tuned to the end, because
we will uncover specific testimonies and others whose stories survived. This hidden history sits at the uncomfortable crossroads of race, gender, and power, yet remains largely invisible in mainstream narratives. Through court records, personal testimonies, visual culture, and scholarly inquiry, this documentary explores how white women's sexual aggression reinforced systems of domination. More than simple reversals of gender, these abuses reflected the twisted logic of slavery itself. So if you think you've heard it all, you haven't. Hit follow on your favorite platform and leave us a comment, because the next story might just change the way you see everything. Don't miss a single twisted turn. To understand how black male slaves came to be victims of sexual coercion and exploitation by white women in the American South, we must first confront the raw structure of slavery itself, a brutal economy built not just on labor, but on total control. Slavery was not a distant, impersonal system. It was intimate. Every relationship between master and enslaved person was defined by one simple truth. The enslaved person had no rights, no legal body, no protection. They could be beaten, sold, starved, or raped without consequence. And although we often picture white men as the sole enforcers of this violence, white women were not passive observers. Many of them were active participants. By the mid-1800s, roughly 40% of slaveholding households in the American South included women as co-owners or sole owners of enslaved people. These women inherited slaves, received them as wedding gifts, and in many cases purchased them directly, selecting human beings from the auction block with cold deliberation. Records from Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia reveal white women listing enslaved persons in wills, filing lawsuits over ownership rights, and managing plantation affairs in the absence, or even in the presence, of their husbands. They were not just keeping house, they were enforcing terror. White women from a young age were trained into the logic of ownership. Girls were often gifted their own enslaved child, usually a girl, as a playmate, servant, or pet. This twisted normalization of power began early. By the time these girls became women, the emotional distance between them and the people they owned was vast. They had learned to equate ownership with love, control with care, and many internalized the belief that enslaved people existed to serve not just their work, but their emotional and even physical needs. Legally, slavery erased the concept of consent. For an enslaved person, the law offered no recognition of rape, male or female, child or adult. It made no difference. A slave's body belonged to their owner. And while much scholarship has rightly focused on the widespread rape of enslaved women by white men, the reverse dynamic white women exploiting enslaved men has been buried beneath silence. But silence is not the same as absence. Let us consider the nature of the plantation household. These were often isolated rural estates, far from neighbors or oversight. The plantation wife, often left alone for long stretches as her husband traveled for business or war, held unchecked authority over the household. That included enslaved men, especially the ones assigned to domestic work. Some were butlers, groomsmen, drivers. Others were blacksmiths, body servants, or simply tasked with labor close to the mistress's quarters. And it is here, in this closeness, that boundaries could be, and were, crossed. Enslaved men in these positions were vulnerable not just to physical demands, but psychological ones. A mistress could demand special attention. She could ask a servant to bathe her, to dress her, to remain nearby during private moments. Over time, these demands could blur the lines between service and submission, and in a world where refusal meant beating, sale, or even death, there was no real choice. We must also confront the role of power in shaping desire. The system of slavery distorted every human relationship it touched. Some white women used sex not for affection, but for domination, for revenge, to assert control over their own husbands or households. In certain cases, historical divorce records reveal white women being accused of conducting relations with their male slaves, leading to scandal, rage, and legal battles. But even when these cases reached court, the black men were rarely treated as victims. Instead, they were portrayed as seducers, threats, or objects of shame. This allowed white society to maintain a dangerous double standard. White women were imagined as morally pure, incapable of aggression, incapable of lust. When evidence of sexual exploitation emerged, it was reinterpreted through this lens. The woman was taken advantage of. The man was dangerous. Even when coerced, the enslaved man was stripped of victimhood and recast as a perpetrator. And yet, in truth, the power imbalance was absolute. A woman who owned a man could demand anything of him, and if he resisted, she could punish him, report him, or have him sold. In the plantation economy, a man's value was tied not just to his labor, but to his reproductive potential. Some women, either for profit or personal control, forced their male slaves to breed with enslaved women. Others pursued them for private, coercive reasons, sometimes forming long-term sexual relationships that were anything but consensual. The culture around these abuses was shaped by silence. For the black men who endured it, there were few places to speak. If they told other enslaved people, they risked scorn or disbelief. If they told the master, they risked punishment. And in many cases, the shame of being violated, especially by a white woman, left the experience buried. We must also remember that enslaved men were denied masculinity by the system. They were portrayed as animals, as tools. They were denied the right to protect their families, to control their bodies, or to express love, to then be violated by the very people who owned them. Women who sometimes mocked their manhood while using their bodies was a profound psychological blow. There is another layer, how society saw these men. In popular culture and pseudoscience of the 19th century, black men were portrayed as both hypersexual and subhuman. These myths served two purposes: to justify their exploitation and to deny them humanity. If a white woman pursued a black man, society assumed he must have tempted her, even though the opposite was often true. These cultural lies not only enabled abuse, they erased it. The records that remain are fragmented, but through letters, testimonies, and the rare voices of the enslaved themselves, a pattern emerges, a system that allowed white women to use sexual violence with impunity, shielded by race, gender, and silence. In the chapters that follow, we will uncover specific testimonies and others whose stories survived. In this chapter, we step into the real stories, the documented, humanized fragments that reveal the pain and powerlessness of black male slaves abused by white women. These are not legends or vague generalizations. These are testimonies, names and cases, delivered through the cracks of history with all the weight of what was once unspeakable. Let's begin with one of the few names that appears again and again in the archival record: Edmund. In 1824, Kentucky, a white planter filed for divorce from his wife on the grounds that she was engaged in a licentious and ongoing affair with a young black male slave named Edmund. The court records are filled with legal language, property rights, marital shame, and improper behavior, but they never speak to Edmund directly. He is referenced only as a possession, the object of the wife's obsession. Her husband claimed that she summoned Edmund to her room nightly. The neighbors whispered. The enslaved were warned not to speak, and the solution? Edmund was sold, quietly, swiftly, no investigation, no defense. What we know about Edmund is tragic. He was described as strong, good-looking, and obedient. The implication, even in legal language, is that he had no say. His compliance was assumed. But consider this. If he had refused her, he could have been whipped or killed, or worse, accused of rape. His only real choice was submission or erasure. And the court chose erasure.